Okay, good afternoon. We're back. I hope you enjoyed the brownie. This is current research session. Our third speaker is going to be Dr. Michelle Soupir, and she's an associate professor in the Agricultural and Biosystems Engineering Department at Iowa State University. Today she will present on her research titled Long-Term Impacts of Poultry Manure Application on Water Quality. All yours.
That's great. All right. Can you hear me okay with this mic? Okay. So thank you for the introduction, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak about one of our really long-term studies that we've had going for actually 20 years. And my co-authors on this are Natasha Hoover, who's a research associate, first a master's student and now a research associate in ABE, who has been primarily responsible for managing the project and doing the data analysis. Thank you. And also Dr. Ramesh Kanwar, who was the PI on the project when it first started 20 years ago, and he continues to be involved. So to give you a little bit of history over the project, it's really challenging and exciting to have the opportunity to work with a 20-year data set. But there have been some changes over time, and the questions that we wanted to answer have shifted a little bit. So the project started in 1998. I was in college, and at this time it was set up in a corn and soybean rotation. And the application was, we're looking at poultry manure, so 2 different poultry manure applications, and then a UAN application. Between 2008 and 2011, the emphasis focused on pathogen loss. So we monitored some E. coli, Enterococcus, and Salmonella, so some of the fecal indicator bacteria, and wanted to explore if those organisms from the poultry manure were able to move into the tile drainage lines. And then in 2008, we again changed the focus. This time we switched to a corn-on-corn system. So we switched from that corn and soybean rotation to a corn-on-corn rotation. And I'll give you a little bit more details about the experimental methods as we go along. So we in 2017 was our last year of water quality monitoring, and so we've really been focused on kind of pulling the data together and telling the story. So the goal today is to give you kind of a summary of this 20-year study, present information on soil, so soil phosphorus levels over time, what kind of impact that has had. Look at the impact of the poultry manure on crop yield, and then also the long-term water quality trends, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus. So Iowa leads the United States in egg production. We're the #1 producing state in the nation with 15 billion eggs produced per year. And fun fact, 251 eggs are the estimated per capita consumption in 2013. Eggs are an excellent source of protein and often one of the much lower cost sources of protein. But egg production also means manure production. And roughly about 10 billion pounds are produced annually across the state of Iowa. And poultry manure provides an excellent source of organic fertilizer, but it's also not balanced in the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio. So if we apply poultry manure to meet the nitrogen needs of the crop, then we are over-applying the phosphorus needs of the crop. So that's one of the greatest challenges in efficiently using manure to fertilize crops across the state. So this first figure here shows the poultry. So it shows the landscape regions across the state. So this is the Des Moines lobe region, which is heavily tile drained, and the green dots are turkey production, and then the purple dots are chickens. And then they're also classified as far as the number of animal units per facility. So you can see there are some parts of the state that have really intensive production of poultry. If we were to apply, we have enough poultry manure generated across the state to apply manure to about 7% of all row crop agriculture, Or if we were to look at this on just the acres that are in corn-on-corn production, it would be about 40% of the land that would be applied at an agronomic rate. So this is a great resource for farmers in Iowa. And another thing to consider, so much of the work that has been conducted on poultry manure has been focused on kind of the southeastern part of the United States. In these areas, the temperatures are much warmer, the soils are different, and also the hydrology is very different. So in those areas, the main transport pathway of water loss is going to be in a surface-driven environment. And another thing that's different is in a lot of the studies that we've looked at, the poultry manure is applied to pasture land. So it's almost regarded more as a waste product than a beneficial fertilizer for farmers. And so that provided the opportunity, and the Iowa Egg Council saw the opportunity to do a study here in Iowa and look at the impacts on drained lands. And so this figure here shows essentially the intensity of tile drainage across the United States. So much of the Corn Belt in the upper Midwestern United States is the red color, which are the most intensely drained areas. And so if you look at Iowa, you can see that throughout the state, we're not the most intensely drained part of the United States, but we do have a lot of tile drainage. And so that's a challenge that probably many of you are familiar with. The tile drainage is used to artificially lower the water table, which allows aeration for roots and also good access to the field during planting and harvesting. So it allows us to be able to have the agriculturally productive lands that we do have in much of the state. But this drainage does increase the direct transport of water to surface waters. And especially nitrate is a concern. Nitrate is negatively charged. It does not interact or retained easily by soil particles, and so it easily moves through that soil profile into the drain lines and then is discharged to surface waters. So if you recreate across the state, it's not unusual to see these black tile outlets. So maybe at more of a field scale, those would be discharging locally. And then we also have drainage districts. So you may see up to a 3-foot diameter tile discharging, and that's, water that's been accumulated from, maybe hundreds or even 1,000 acres and then discharged at a single point. Tile lines aren't always known where they are. This is some aerial imagery that kind of shows those patterns. So you can see that after rain events, it becomes more evident where the tile lines are located. And then we talk a lot about the Gulf of Mexico, but that's not the only problem or the only eutrophic zone. So you can see across the entire world, there's lots of areas that are suffering from eutrophication and hypoxic conditions. Yellow is atrophic, red is hypoxic, and then green is recovering. And there's only a couple green points up here. So this is not a problem that's unique to this part of the United States. Okay, so moving on to the methods and our experimental design. So the first phase of the study from 1998 to 2009 was in a corn-soybean rotation. This was a split plot design so that each plot was half soybeans and half corn, and then the drain line would go through the middle of the plot. The plots are located at the Ag Engineering and Agronomy Research Farm, so that's just west of campus, so it's nice and close. One challenge with the site is you can see that each of our plots are a different size. This was built upon a drainage system from actually the 60s, and so but for the most part, the drain lines go through the middle of each of these plots. And then the treatments, we had a UAN treatment at 168 kilograms per hectare, which was to meet the nitrogen requirements of corn, only applied to the corn side, so prior to corn planting. And then poultry manure was applied at 2 rates, we call PM1 and PM2. So at the needs of the crop, and then at double. And at the time, the thought was that we needed to dispose of poultry manure, and so it might be that we would apply at twice the rate, and so that was the reason for that. We have a check plot that has received no application, and I haven't included that in the results of this study. And then from 2010 to 2017, we changed this to a corn-on-corn study. And so the UAN was then applied at the recommended rate of 224 kilograms per hectare, and then the poultry manure was applied at half the rate, and then also at the recommended rate. So a little bit different change in the design there. And then we also expanded our monitoring site for just a couple of years and looked at some no-till plots. So just located down pretty close to our chisel plow plots, there were also some small no-till plots that had been maintained as no-tills for a good period of time. And so throughout about a 2 to 3 year period, we also monitored those, and we looked at the microbial transport into tiles from both the chisel plow and the no-till plots. And then here you can see the picture that shows kind of the differences between the no-till and the chisel plow. So manure application practices. So one important point is that the manure was applied in the spring. We did that whenever we could get into the field, and then as soon as the manure was applied, we would typically chisel plow if it was one of the plowed plots, and then we would also plant right after that. And then soil samples have been collected every fall. We've done shallow sampling, either 0 to 15 or 0 to 30 centimeters, and then every couple of years we've done more deep core sampling to see, really trying to track the phosphorus levels deeper down into the soil profile. And then this is one of our graduate students, our former graduate students, is collecting the water quality samples. And so basically you can climb down into these sumps and stick a bottle underneath a tile drain outlet. And then we also, for some parts of the period, we had flow weighted sampling, so every so many times the pump turned on in the sump, then we would sip off a sample. But then more recently we've moved to grab sample collection. Okay, so let's start out by looking at the soil phosphorus levels over this 20-year period. And I want to walk you through this to try to color coordinate it to make it easier to follow. So the first batch that I'm presenting is 1998 to 2002, so the early years of the project. And you can see that the soil phosphorus was a little bit higher from the PM2 plot, so statistically higher than it was from the PM or the UAN plots. So you can see here, this is the treatment, this is the application rate underneath it, and then this is the time period. And then I put kind of the major result is also trying to color coordinate with that. So, but you have to remember that this study did not have a history of manure application, and so this was really kind of the first few years of applying manure to the site. Then from 1998 to 2007, we did continue to see that the soil phosphorus increased over time from the plots that received the poultry manure for both the single and the double application rate. And then over the last period, so this is when we switched to a corn-on-corn rotation, so that's something that's really different here is that now the plots are receiving manure, the entire plot is receiving manure every single year instead of just half the plot switching back and forth. And so again, as expected, the soil phosphorus from the UAN plot is really low, and our soil phosphorus levels from this PM2 plot is really high, over 200 for the Bray P in parts per million. So we have, as expected, over 20 years seen a buildup of soil P in the soil, and this has been in pretty much the top soil, so the 0 to 15 or 0 to 30 centimeters. So what is the impact of the manure application on drainage? So I think something that's maybe hot again, but is what is the relationship between soil health and water quality? And so that's one of the assessments that we're going to do here is when we're working on right now is soil health assessment. But this is a really nice data set because one of the things that obviously benefits soil health is long-term manure application. And so when we look at the nitrate export to the tile drainage, over the first years of the study, the poultry manure at the double application rate had the highest loss to subsurface drainage. But you can see that Neither of them were significantly different from the UAN treatments. So moving on through the study period from 98 through 2009, the single poultry manure application rate had considerably lower rate than the UAN. And this is interesting because these are applied at the same nitrogen application rate. So we saw a lower nitrate loss from the system that had received poultry manure relative to a UAN treatment. And then when we've moved to the corn-on-corn system, right now the PM2 and the UAN are the two to compare, and there's no statistically significant difference between those two, even though the mass loss is lower from the PM2. And then when we apply at half the poultry manure application, of course, we expected to see the lower nitrate removal. So this has been encouraging for egg producers to see that the poultry manure had either a positive benefit on nitrate water quality or at least a comparable loss to the UAN. This shows over the entire study period the monthly concentrations, and just kind of shows the trend. So the orange is the corn-on-corn system, and then the green is the earlier phase of the study, which was in the corn and soybean rotation. So the corn-on-corn system does overall, each month tend to have the highest concentration of UAN or losses from the UAN and the poultry manure plot. So the blocks are the UAN, and then the circle is the poultry manure applied at the same rate. In general, you can see an increase in those concentrations throughout the early spring and then lower concentrations as you move into the fall. The number of samples that we had available would also drastically decrease as we moved into the July, August, September timeline. So these are small enough of a scale of a plot that they would tend to drain in early spring, dry up, and then just respond to events after that. So let's look at the phosphorus losses, right? So we already talked about how the soil P levels are really increasing, so we expect that we would start to see increase in phosphorus losses to the tile drainage. So for the first phase of the study, there wasn't that much of a difference in soil P levels, so we also didn't detect any differences in dissolved reactive phosphorus losses to drainage. When we looked at the next time period from 1998 to 2009, again, there were no statistically significant differences among these plots. So after a 10-year period of poultry manure application on a corn and soybean rotation, there wasn't enough buildup in the soil to be able to detect a difference in phosphorus, BRP, and drainage from a chisel plow system. And then as we moved into the corn-on-corn and annual poultry manure application, we still don't see any statistically significant differences, but from the two poultry manure plots, we are definitely starting to see higher loadings from those sites. So we don't quite have all the data analyzed from the 15 through 2017, but some of the concentration data does start to look like we might see a statistically significant difference there. So keep tuned, I guess, but after a pretty significant period of time, we didn't see differences. And so another thing that we are doing kind of as we wrap up this study is doing some P-sorption studies to try to see what kind of P-sorption capacity these soils actually have. And then corn yields actually also had a positive response to the poultry manure. So from the early phases of the study, so this is just the corn yield. The next phase, the next slide shows the soybean yields. And these yields, so 9,000 kilograms per hectare is about 143 bushels per acre. So that's to just help you. And sometimes our yields were actually quite low because we had such a hard time getting the poultry manure applied before we could get planting. And so there were some years where our overall yield was not great, but for comparison purposes is still included here. And so in the first phase of the study, basically UAN yields were lower than the PM2 yield, but for that you would want to really compare the PM to the UAN. Second phase of the study, again, we saw higher yield, but it was at double the application rate, so it wouldn't be something we would want to recommend. However, as we've moved into the third phase of the study, you can see that the poultry manure at the single application rate was greater than the UAN, and the PM2 was also greater than the UAN, and these two are comparable. Okay, so it does indicate that corn yields did benefit from the poultry manure application. And we also saw the same with the soybean yields throughout the earlier part of the study. So 98 through 2002, we had no statistically significant differences, but then the differences did show up in the second phase of that study. So this is another justification for longer term funding for water quality research. Some of these results are appearing at the 10-year mark and the 20-year mark, which is much later than the typical 3-year period that we have to draw results. So quickly, we also looked at the bacteria transport, and that's been something that we monitored E. coli, salmonella, and enterococcus. And I just have the results of the E. coli here for 2010 and 2011. 2010 was a really wet year, and 2011 was a really dry year. So you can see differences in the concentrations. The black bars are our no-till plots, and the gray bars are the chisel plow. So you can see that losses were reduced by tillage. Another thing that we like to point out here is that for the primary contact recreation and secondary contact recreation, those concentrations were not exceeded for the chisel plow plots. They were exceeded for a few conditions during the wet year from the no-till plots, but from the chisel plow plots, we just didn't see a whole lot of movement into the tile drainage system. We saw our peak occurrences occur during events. So this is enterococcus on the top, and this is E. coli hours after a rainfall event, and big blue is the rainfall intensity, and then the black lines of the tile flow rate. But what's interesting is if you look at the dots and the diamonds are the bacteria concentrations, and you can see they clearly peak after that storm event, and then with that first flush, and then they decrease with the lag of the storm. And they also relate to the manure application rate. So the higher manure application rate did have the higher concentrations, as you would expect. Okay, so to summarize, over the 20-year study, we saw that buildup of phosphorus in the top, the plow zone of the soil. In general, poultry manure did have a positive impact on crop yields, both corn and soybean. And then the water quality story from nitrate, it appears that there is equal to or less nitrate in drainage from the poultry manure amended plots. And then to date, through 2014, we did not see statistically significant differences in the phosphorus levels in drainage, with, of course, the last few years of the study still pending. And then we did see differences in transport from bacteria due to tillage, so the no-till versus the chisel plow. And then also the wet year, we had higher losses than we would see in a dry year. And so I want to make sure to acknowledge there's been many graduate students that have worked on this project over the years. We've even had 2 different water quality lab managers. So Lauren Shires worked on this project until about 2010, and then Leanne Long worked on the project for more recently. The Ag Engineering Research Farm has consistently provided assistance with managing the plots, harvesting the crops, applying the manure, and in the good old days, the Ag and Home Economics Experiment Station provided funding for this, and then Carl Peterson was an important technician throughout the study. And then funding has been the Iowa Egg Council, so to them for having the foresight to fund such a long-term project. And then Sparrow Farms and Farm Nutrients have provided the manure. And then we've also had funding from the Leopold Center and the Vietnam Education Foundation. Okay, I said I wasn't going to talk for 30 minutes, but I was
we'll still have time.
Yeah.
We have time for a couple of questions, so if,
sorry if I missed it, but for the UAN applications, what was the P application rate? Was there any P applied or not?
So we have done some as-needed applications to the farm, but we have not done a consistent P application to the UAN plots. And if you saw from the soil P levels, we're
Right.
getting pretty low. So we've done it, I think we're going to do it this year, and we had done it 2 years ago, but there's not been something that's been consistently done throughout the study.
Last question.
Did you see any change in soil organic carbon over the 20-year period?
We haven't monitored that, but we are testing that right, Leanne. So we have collected samples from the no-till, the control, the no manure plots, and we're doing a pretty extensive suite of soil health parameters right now.
Last question now. No, he was the last.
Quick thoughts on the plant available nitrogen in poultry manure in terms of organic versus inorganic and rate of release and that kind of thing, what's assumed in the study?
Yeah, so we assumed a 5% immediate loss and then 60% availability, and that was based upon Iowa State Extension recommendations.